Lynn was always the first to arrive at school and the last to leave. Not because she loved school, far from it. The 13-year-old girl with jet black hair and worn-out sneakers just preferred the empty hallways to the crowded ones, where eyes followed her every move. This morning was no different. Lynn hugged her backpack close to her chest as she walked through the front doors of Oak Ridge Middle School. The smell of floor cleaner still hung in the air, and the early morning sun cast long shadows through the hallway windows. "Good morning, Lynn," called Mr. Parker, the janitor, as he pushed his mop bucket past her. His friendly smile was one of the few she could count on each day. "Morning," she replied softly, offering a small wave. Lynn had moved to this small American town just 8 months ago. Her parents had left everything behind in their small apartment in Beijing. Friends, family, their community, all for what her father called a better chance. Lynn wasn't sure what was better about being the only Chinese girl in a school where no one could pronounce her name correctly and where lunch became a daily exercise in loneliness. Lynn made her way to her locker, spinning the combination with practiced ease. She had decorated the inside with a single photo, her grandmother standing next to an old upright piano, her wrinkled hand resting on Lynn's much smaller shoulder. Lynn touched the photo gently before grabbing her books for the morning classes. The piano. That's what Lynn missed the most. Her grandmother had taught her to play when she was just 5 years old. Their tiny apartment in Beijing had barely fit the old instrument, but it had been the heart of their home. When things got bad financially, the piano was the first thing they sold. Lynn still remembered watching two strangers carry it down the narrow staircase, feeling as if they were taking a piece of her heart with them. As more students began to fill the hallways, Lynn quickened her pace. She still had 20 minutes before first period, and she knew exactly where she wanted to go. The music room was tucked away at the end of the east wing, far enough from the main hallway that few students wandered there before classes. Lynn slipped inside and flipped on just one set of lights. The room was spacious compared to the other classrooms, with chairs arranged in a semicircle and various instruments stored in cases along the walls. But Lynn only had eyes for one thing, the grand piano that sat in the corner of the room. It was nothing like her grandmother's modest upright. This was a gleaming black Steinway, its surface so polished that Lynn could see her reflection in it. She approached it slowly, almost reverently, her backpack sliding from her shoulders to the floor. Lynn never played it. She wouldn't dare. Mrs. Hudson, the music teacher, was very strict about who could touch the expensive instrument. Besides, Lynn didn't want anyone to know she could play. That was a piece of her old life, a secret she kept close to her heart. But every morning she would spend these quiet moments just being near it. Sometimes she would lift the fallboard that covered the keys and look at them, the perfect pattern of black and white that had once felt like home under her fingers. Today she simply stood beside it, running her fingertips lightly over its curved edge. "What are you doing in here, China girl?" The voice made Lynn jump. She turned to see Zoe and her friends standing in the doorway, designer backpacks slung carelessly over their shoulders. Zoe was the kind of girl who seemed to float through school on a cloud of confidence and expensive perfume. Her long blonde hair was always perfect, her clothes always new. "Nothing," Lynn said quickly, stepping away from the piano. "Just waiting for class." Zoe walked into the room, her friends trailing behind her like a small army. "Doesn't look like nothing. Looks like you were touching Mrs. Hudson's piano." Her voice had that fake sweetness that Lynn had learned meant trouble was coming. "I was just looking," Lynn said, reaching down to grab her backpack. Maybe if she left now, they would lose interest. But Zoe stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Do you even know what that is? Or do you only play those weird string things in China?" Her friends giggled on cue, and Lynn felt her cheeks grow hot. She knew Zoe was talking about the guzheng, a traditional Chinese instrument her grandmother had shown her once at a cultural center. The ignorance would have been funny if it wasn't so hurtful. "I know what a piano is," Lynn said quietly, eyes fixed on the floor. "Oh, it speaks," said Paige, Zoe's closest friend, her eyes wide with mock surprise. "And here I thought you only knew how to say fried rice and egg roll." More laughter. Lynn clutched the straps of her backpack tighter, wishing she could disappear. This wasn't new. Ever since her first day when she had struggled to introduce herself in class, Zoe and her friends had made it their mission to remind Lynn that she didn't belong. "Maybe she thinks she can play it," Zoe said, Walking over to the piano and dramatically lifting the fallboard, she pressed a few random keys, the discordant notes echoing painfully in the room. Like this, China girl? Is this music where you come from? Something twisted in Lynn's chest as Zoe mockingly slammed her hands on the beautiful instrument. Those keys that could create such beauty reduced to a joke. Please stop, Lynn said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Hudson doesn't let anyone play it. Mrs. Hudson doesn't let anyone play it, Paige repeated in a sing-song voice, mimicking Lynn's accent. Are you going to tell on us, China girl? Lynn shook her head, just wanting this to be over. The bell would ring soon and they would have to go to class. She just needed to wait it out. Zoe, bored with the piano, turned her attention back to Lynn. So what were you really doing in here? This isn't even near your first class. Lynn didn't answer. How could she explain that this room with the piano was the only place that felt even a little bit like home? I bet she comes in here to practice her weird little bow, said Amelia, the third girl in Zoe's group. She bent at the waist, putting her hands together in an exaggerated gesture that looked nothing like a proper bow. Thank you very much, she said in a terrible accent. The girls dissolved into laughter again, and Lynn felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She blinked hard, determined not to cry in front of them. "Aw, look, we hurt her feelings," Zoe said, not sounding sorry at all. She stepped closer to Lynn, her voice dropping lower. Listen, China girl, this school has enough weirdos without you creeping around in empty rooms. Why don't you just— Good morning, ladies. The voice from the doorway made all of them turn. Mrs. Hudson stood there, her arms folded across her chest, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. The music teacher was in her 50s with salt and pepper hair cut in a practical bob and a no-nonsense attitude that even Zoe respected. Morning. Mrs. Hudson, Zoe said sweetly, instantly transforming into a model student. We were just showing Lynn around the music room. She seemed interested in the piano. Mrs. Hudson's gaze flicked to Lynn, then to the open piano, then back to Zoe. How thoughtful of you, she said, her tone making it clear she didn't believe a word. But I believe the warning bell is about to ring, and none of you are in my first period class. As if on cue, the bell rang, its shrill sound echoing down the hallway. Off you go, Mrs. Hudson said, holding the door open expectantly. With perfect smiles and not a hair out of place, Zoe and her friends filed past the teacher. Paige turned at the last moment and mouthed China girl at Lynn before disappearing into the hallway. Lynn moved to follow them, head down, but Mrs. Hudson gently touched her arm. Lynn, are you all right? She asked, her voice softer now. Lynn nodded quickly. Yes, thank you. I need to get to math class. Mrs. Hudson looked like she wanted to say more, but instead nodded and let Lynn pass. The music room is open every morning, she said as Lynn reached the doorway. Anyone who appreciates music is welcome here. Lynn paused, surprised by the kindness in the teacher's voice, but didn't turn around. She couldn't explain why she came to the music room every morning, why she needed to be near the piano but never dared to play it. So she just nodded and hurried off to her first class, already dreading lunch period when she would inevitably sit alone again. The morning classes passed in a blur. Lynn was a good student, excellent actually. Her English might still be a work in progress, but she excelled in math and science. Not that it helped her make friends. If anything, it just gave Zoe and her group another reason to roll their eyes when Lynn raised her hand in class. As lunchtime approached, Lynn felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She considered skipping lunch altogether. It wouldn't be the first time, but she knew her mother would ask about the untouched lunchbox when she got home. Her mom worked so hard to pack Lynn's favorite foods each day, trying to give her a small taste of home. With a deep breath, Lynn entered the crowded cafeteria. The noise hit her like a physical force, hundreds of conversations, laughter, chairs scraping against the floor. Lynn scanned the room, looking for an empty table, or at least one with enough space that she could sit at the end without bothering anyone. She spotted a half-empty table near the windows and made her way toward it, careful not to make eye contact with Zoe's group at their prime location in the center of the cafeteria. Lynn had almost reached the table when she heard a familiar voice call out, "Hey everyone, look who's here, it's China Girl." Lynn froze, her lunchbox clutched tightly in her hands. She could feel eyes turning toward her, could hear the whispers starting. 8 months at this school and nothing had changed. She was still the outsider, still the joke. In that moment, Lynn made a decision. Instead of continuing to the table, she turned and walked straight out of the cafeteria. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her sit alone again. As she pushed through the double doors, she heard Zoe's laughter following her. Lynn's feet carried her back to the one place she felt safe, the music room. It would be empty now, with Mrs. Hudson on lunch duty. Lynn slipped inside, closing the door behind her, finally letting out the breath she'd been holding. The grand piano stood silently in the corner, bathed in the midday sunlight streaming through the windows. Lynn approached it slowly, her lunch forgotten in her hands. For the first time since arriving at this school, she felt a resolve building inside her. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to remember who she really was. Lynn set her lunchbox on a nearby chair and stood before the piano, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought of her grandmother, of the hours they had spent together making music. She thought of Zoe's mocking fingers on the keys this morning. And then, very gently, Lynn lifted the fallboard and revealed the keys beneath. She didn't sit. Not yet, she wasn't ready to play. But as her fingers hovered over the familiar pattern of black and white, Lynn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to find herself in this strange new world. And maybe, when she was ready, those same people who had laughed at her would finally see her, really see her for the first time. 3 weeks had passed since that day in the music room, and Lynn had settled into a new routine. Every day during lunch, instead of braving the cafeteria, she would take her lunchbox to the library. The librarian, Ms. Reyes, had noticed her pattern, and now kept a small table near the biography section reserved for her. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was kindness, and Lynn was grateful for it. Today, though, something was different. As Lynn walked through the hallways, she noticed colorful posters taped to the walls. Spring Talent Show, they proclaimed in bold letters. Sign up now. Auditions this Friday. Lynn paused in front of one of the posters, reading the smaller print. The show would be held in the school auditorium next month, with parents and the community invited. Cash prizes would be awarded for the top 3 performances. Are you thinking of signing up? Lynn turned to find Aiden, a quiet boy from her science class, standing beside her. He was one of the few students who actually talked to her, mostly because they were lab partners. Me? No, Lynn said quickly, shaking her head. I don't have any talents. Aiden raised an eyebrow. Everyone's got something they're good at, he said. I'm doing a magic act. Been practicing for weeks. Lynn smiled politely but didn't respond. What would she even do in a talent show? The only thing she had ever been good at was playing the piano, and that was a part of her life she had locked away. Anyway, auditions are in the music room on Friday after school. Aiden continued. You should come watch, even if you don't want to participate. Before Lynn could respond, the warning bell rang, sending students scurrying to their next classes. Aiden waved goodbye and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Lynn staring at the poster. A talent show. Lynn remembered the competitions her grandmother had entered her in back in Beijing. The hours of practice, the nervous excitement backstage, the rush of playing for an audience. She had loved it once. But that was before. Shaking off the memories, Lynn hurried to her next class. The rest of the week passed in a blur of classes and homework. By Friday, it seemed like everyone was talking about the talent show auditions. Even Zoe and her friends were planning to participate, performing a dance routine they'd been practicing during lunch. Lynn had almost forgotten Aiden's invitation to watch the auditions when she spotted him in the hallway after the final bell. Hey, Lynn, are you coming to auditions? He called, waving her over. Lynn hesitated. She had planned to head straight home. But something, curiosity maybe, or just the desire to do something different for once, made her nod. Great. I'm heading there now, Aiden said, falling into step beside her. As they approached the music room, Lynn could hear voices and laughter spilling from the open door. The hallway was lined with nervous students practicing routines or going over lyrics. Lynn felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But Aiden was already leading the way inside, and Lynn followed reluctantly. The room was more crowded than she had ever seen it. Chairs had been arranged to face the grand piano, which had been moved to serve as a focal point. Mrs. Hudson sat at a small table with 2 other teachers, clipboards in front of them. Sign-up sheet is by the door, Mrs. Hudson called to them. We're going in order of registration. Aiden scribbled his name on the sheet. Lynn stood awkwardly to the side, scanning the room for an empty seat. She spotted one in the back corner and made her way toward it, keeping her head down. The auditions began with a boy playing the trumpet, badly. Lynn winced at some of the sour notes but clapped politely when he finished. Next came a girl who sang a popular song, her voice surprisingly strong and confident. Several more acts followed, a comedy routine, a gymnastics demonstration on the cleared floor space, more singers. Lynn was so caught up in watching that she didn't notice Zoe and her friends entering the room until she heard their distinctive laughter. They took seats near the front, whispering and pointing at some of the performers. When Aiden's turn came, Lynn sat up straighter. He performed a series of card tricks that were actually quite impressive, ending with a flourish that made everyone applaud enthusiastically. Lynn caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up as he returned to his seat. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd thinned. Some students left after their auditions while others stayed to watch. By the time Zoe's group performed their dance routine, which was, Lynn had to admit, quite good, only about 20 people remained in the room. All right, that's everyone who signed up, Mrs. Hudson announced, checking her list. Thank you all for coming. We'll post the final show lineup on Monday morning. Students began gathering their things and filing out of the room. Lynn waited for the crowd to thin before standing up. She had almost reached the door when Mrs. Hudson called her name. Lynn, a moment please. Confused, Lynn turned back. Had she done something wrong? But Mrs. Hudson was smiling as she approached. I noticed you watching the auditions, the teacher said. Did you enjoy them? Lynn nodded. Yes, everyone was very talented. Not everyone, Mrs. Hudson said with a chuckle. But they all had courage, and that's what matters. She paused, studying Lynn's face. You know, we're still accepting late auditions until Monday morning if you're interested. Lynn's heart skipped a beat. Oh, no, I don't. Mrs. Hudson. Zoe's voice cut through their conversation. She approached with Paige and Amelia in tow. We forgot to tell you, we need to use special shoes for our routine in the actual show. Is that okay? That should be fine, Zoe, Mrs. Hudson replied. Just make sure they don't scuff the stage. Zoe nodded, then seemed to notice Lynn for the first time. Oh, look who's here. Were you auditioning, China girl? Her tone made it clear how ridiculous she found the idea. Lynn was just watching today, Mrs. Hudson said smoothly. Actually, I was just suggesting she might want to audition on Monday. Zoe's eyebrows shot up. Really? What would she do? She turned to Lynn with mock curiosity. Do you sing, dance? Her eyes drifted to the piano and a smirk formed on her lips. Or maybe you play piano. Lynn felt her cheeks burning. How had Zoe guessed? Or was it just a coincidence? I don't know. Lynn mumbled, wishing she could disappear. Well, whatever hidden talent you have, we can't wait to see it, Zoe said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. She turned to her friends. Come on, let's go. My mom's waiting. The three girls sauntered out, giggling among themselves. Lynn waited until they were gone before looking back at Mrs. Hudson. I should go too, she said quietly. Mrs. Hudson sighed. Lynn, I don't mean to pry, but I've noticed you in here in the mornings. The way you look at the piano. Do you play? Lynn hesitated, then gave a small nod. I thought so, Mrs. Hudson said, a gentle smile crossing her face. Would you like to play now? The room is empty and I need to straighten up anyway. Lynn's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't touched a piano in almost a year. Would she even remember how? And yet the invitation was tempting, so tempting that it scared her. I don't think so, Lynn said finally. But thank you, Mrs. Hudson nodded, not pushing further. Well, the offer stands. For the audition, too. Think about it over the weekend. Lynn thanked her and hurried out of the room, her mind swirling with thoughts she had tried so hard to suppress. The hallways were mostly empty now, the school quiet as the weekend began. Lynn was so lost in thought that she didn't notice she had taken a wrong turn until she found herself in an unfamiliar corridor. As she turned to retrace her steps, she heard voices echoing from around the corner, familiar voices that made her freeze in place. Did you see her face when I mentioned the piano? It was Zoe laughing. Like she was about to cry or something. I should go too, she said quietly. Mrs. Hudson sighed. Lynn, I don't mean to pry, but I've noticed you in here in the mornings. The way you look at the piano. Do you play? Lynn hesitated, then gave a small nod. I thought so, Mrs. Hudson said, a gentle smile crossing her face. Would you like to play now? The room is empty and I need to straighten up anyway. Lynn's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't touched a piano in almost a year. Would she even remember how? And yet the invitation was tempting. So tempting that it scared her. I don't think so, Lynn said finally. But thank you. Mrs. Hudson nodded, not pushing further. While the offer stands. For the audition, too. Think about it over the weekend. Lynn thanked her and hurried out of the room, her mind swirling with thoughts she had tried so hard to suppress. The hallways were mostly empty now, the school quiet as the weekend began. Lynn was so lost in thought that she didn't notice she had taken a wrong turn until she found herself in an unfamiliar corridor. As she turned to retrace her steps, she heard voices echoing from around the corner, familiar voices that made her freeze in place. Did you see her face when I mentioned the piano? It was Zoe laughing, like she was about to cry or something. I still think we should follow her home one day, said Paige. I bet she lives in some weird Chinese restaurant or something. Lynn pressed herself against the wall, hoping they wouldn't come her way. She didn't want another confrontation, not today. Maybe she does play piano, Amelia said, like one of those child prodigy things. They all play piano or violin, right? Please, Zoe scoffed. She can barely speak English. I doubt she can read music. I don't know, said Paige thoughtfully. Remember when Mrs. Chen gave us that history test and she was the only one who got an A? Whatever, Zoe said dismissively. If she auditions on Monday, we'll all be there to watch her fail. It'll be hilarious. Their voices faded as they moved away down another hallway. Lynn stayed frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. They were going to come watch her? But she wasn't even planning to audition, was she? Lynn found her way back to the main hallway and pushed through the front doors of the school. The afternoon sun was warm on her face as she began the walk home, her mind replaying the conversations of the day. That night, after dinner, Lynn sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the photo of her grandmother that she kept on her nightstand. The same photo that hung in her locker. What should I do, Nai? She whispered, tracing her grandmother's face with her fingertip. Lynn knew what her grandmother would say. She would tell Lynn to be brave, to play from her heart, to show them who she really was. But Lynn wasn't sure she could be that person anymore. What if she tried and failed? What if they laughed at her? But then again, what if they didn't? Lynn lay back on her bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to remember the feeling of playing, really playing. The way the music would flow through her fingers. The way time would seem to stop when she was lost in a piece. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to find that feeling again. Monday morning arrived with a knot of anxiety in Lynn's stomach. She had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. She had made her decision sometime in the early hours of the morning, but now, standing in front of the school, she wasn't sure she had the courage to follow through. Lynn took a deep breath and walked through the front doors, heading straight for the music room. It was earlier than she usually arrived, so early that even Mr. Parker hadn't started his morning rounds yet. The hallways were silent as Lynn made her way to the east wing. The music room door was closed but not locked. Lynn hesitated, her hand on the doorknob, then pushed it open. The room was dark except for the gray light of early morning filtering through the windows. The grand piano stood in its usual spot, its polished surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. Lynn set her backpack down and approached the piano slowly. This time she didn't just lift the fallboard, she pulled out the bench and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. "You can do this," she whispered to herself in Mandarin. "Remember who you are." And then, for the first time since leaving Beijing, Lin Chen began to play. The music flowed from Lin's fingertips like water. She started with simple scales, just to feel the keys beneath her fingers again, to remember the weight and resistance of each note. But soon, almost without realizing it, she had shifted into a piece she had played 100 times before. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Her grandmother had taught it to her when she was 9, and Lin's fingers remembered every note. The familiar melody filled the empty room, soft and melancholy at first, then building with emotion. Lin closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. She had forgotten how it felt, this sense of freedom, of speaking a language that needed no words. For the first time since moving to America, Lin felt wholly herself. As the final notes faded, Lin kept her eyes closed, savoring the moment. Then a sound broke the silence, the sound of clapping. Lynn's eyes flew open. Mrs. Hudson stood in the doorway, her face lit with wonder. "That was extraordinary," the music teacher said, stepping into the room. "Truly beautiful, Lynn." Lynn felt her cheeks grow hot. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Don't apologize," Mrs. Hudson interrupted, approaching the piano. "That's what this instrument is for, to be played, and you play it magnificently." She tilted her head, studying Lynn with new eyes. "Where did you learn?" "My grandmother taught me," Lynn said softly. "Back home in Beijing. She was a piano teacher." Mrs. Hudson nodded thoughtfully. "She taught you well." "That was Chopin, wasn't it?" Lynn nodded, surprised that Mrs. Hudson recognized it. "I played a bit in college," Mrs. Hudson explained, noticing Lynn's expression. "Nothing like what you just did, though." She paused, then asked carefully, "Why haven't you played since you've been here?" Lynn looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys. "We had to sell our piano before we moved. And then, I don't know. It felt like something from my old life. Something I had to leave behind." Mrs. Hudson sat on the edge of a nearby chair. "Music is never something you leave behind, Lynn. It's a part of you." She gestured to the piano. "And clearly it's a big part." Lynn didn't know how to respond. It was true. She had missed playing more than she had allowed herself to admit. But the thought of playing in front of others, of exposing this vulnerable piece of herself to people like Zoe, made her stomach twist with anxiety. "I was thinking about what you said," Lynn said finally. "About auditioning for the talent show." Mrs. Hudson's face brightened. "You'd be wonderful. The best act by far. But what if—" Lynn hesitated, not wanting to sound childish. "What if people laugh at me?" "Why would anyone laugh at talent like that?" Mrs. Hudson asked gently. Lynn thought about Zoe and her friends, about the way they mocked everything about her. Her accent, her clothes, even the food her mother packed for lunch. "Some people don't need a reason," she said quietly. Understanding dawned in Mrs. Hudson's eyes. "Ah, I see." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "You know, I've been teaching for 27 years. I've seen thousands of students come through this school. And I've noticed something. People who mock others are usually the ones most afraid of being mocked themselves." Lynn considered this. She tried to imagine Zoe being afraid of anything, but it was hard to picture. "The audition is at 3 o'clock today," Mrs. Hudson continued. "If you decide to come, I'll make sure you have privacy. No audience except the judges. Would that help?" Lynn felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe she could do this after all. "I think so," she said. "Yes," Mrs. Hudson smiled. "Good. Now why don't you play something else before the bell rings? Something you love. Just for practice." Lynn thought for a moment, then positioned her hands again. This time she chose a piece her grandmother had composed. A delicate, intricate melody that always reminded Lynn of rain falling on the roof of their apartment in Beijing. As she played, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice guiding her. "Music is about feelings, Xiaolin. Let your heart speak through your fingers." When the warning bell rang, Lynn reluctantly closed the piano and gathered her backpack. For the first time in months, she walked to her first class with her head held high. She had made her decision. She would audition, and whatever happened afterward, well, she would face that when it came. The day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Lynn found it impossible to concentrate on her classes. During math, she caught herself tapping out fingerings on her desk. In history, she mentally reviewed the piece she would play, Chopin's Fantaisie Impromptu, one of the most challenging pieces in her repertoire, but also the one that had won her first place in her last competition in Beijing. When the final bell rang, Lynn hurried to her locker. As she exchanged her books, she noticed Zoe and her friends clustered at the end of the hallway, glancing in her direction and whispering. Lynn's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to ignore them. She was about to head to the music room when she felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Aiden, smiling shyly. "Hey, I heard you're auditioning today," he said. "That's awesome." Lynn blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "Mrs. Hudson mentioned it in music class," Aiden explained. "She said you play piano. Is that true?" Lynn nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Cool," Aiden said. "I'll be rooting for you." "Thanks," Lynn replied, touched by his kindness. "Your magic act was really good on Friday." Aiden grinned. made it into the show. Maybe you will too. As Aiden walked away, Lynn realized that Zoe and her friends were heading towards the music room. Her heart sank. So much for a private audition. Mrs. Hudson had probably announced it to the whole school. For a moment, Lynn considered going home instead. But then she thought of her grandmother. Of all the competitions where she had played in front of hundreds of people, she could handle 3 mean girls. Taking a deep breath, Lynn walked to the music room, her head high despite the nervous fluttering in her chest. The room was arranged as it had been for Friday's auditions, with the grand piano as the centerpiece. Mrs. Hudson and 2 other teachers sat at their table, and as Lynn had feared, Zoe, Paige, and Amelia were already there, seated in the front row. "Ah, Lynn, right on time," Mrs. Hudson said warmly. If she noticed Lynn's discomfort at the unexpected audience, she didn't show it. "Whenever you're ready." Lynn approached the piano, aware of the smirks on Zoe's face. She could hear them whispering, could imagine what they were saying. But as she sat down at the piano bench, an odd calm settled over her. She adjusted her position, placed her hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. The room fell silent. Even Zoe and her friends stopped whispering, waiting for Lynn to begin, probably waiting for her to fail. Lynn closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. Then she began to play. The opening notes of Fantasy Impromptu filled the room. Fast, intricate, demanding absolute precision and control. Lynn's fingers flew across the keys, finding each note with perfect accuracy. The music surged and swelled, growing more complex with each measure. Lynn was dimly aware of the shocked silence in the room, but she was too lost in the music to care. This piece had always been special to her, a piece that required not just technical skill but emotional depth. As she played, Lynn poured everything into the music, her loneliness, her homesickness, her frustration, but also her pride, her determination, her love for her family. When the piece reached its dramatic middle section, with its soaring melody and cascading accompaniment, Lynn heard a gasp from somewhere in the room. But she didn't falter. If anything, the sound pushed her to play even better, to show these people who she really was. As the final chords resonated through the room, Lynn opened her eyes. The 3 teachers were staring at her, their faces a mixture of shock and wonder. Mrs. Hudson had tears in her eyes. And Zoe and her friends, Lynn almost laughed at their expressions. Zoe's mouth was actually hanging open, her planned mockery forgotten in the face of what she had just witnessed. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then Mrs. Hudson cleared her throat. "Well," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I think it's safe to say you'll be in the show." The other teachers nodded vigorously, still looking stunned. One of them, Mr. Reynolds from the math department, leaned forward. "How long have you been playing, Lynn?" he asked. "Since I was 5, Lynn answered, suddenly shy again now that the music had stopped. "Incredible," Mrs. Hudson murmured. She made a note on her clipboard, then looked up with a smile. "You'll be closing the show. It's the spot we reserve for the best act." Lynn felt a warm glow of pride. Closing the show. She had done it. As she gathered her things to leave, Lynn couldn't help glancing at Zoe and her friends. They were huddled together, whispering urgently. When Zoe caught Lynn looking, she quickly looked away, but not before Lynn saw the expression on her face. No longer mockery, but something that looked almost like respect. Lynn stepped out into the hallway, feeling lighter than she had in months. She had done it. She had played again, had shown them who she really was, and it had felt wonderful. As she walked toward the main doors, Lynn heard rapid footsteps behind her. She turned, half expecting to see Zoe ready with some new insult, but it was Aiden running to catch up with her. "I heard you from the hallway," he said, slightly out of breath. "That was amazing, Lynn. I had no idea you could play like that." Lynn smiled, surprised by how good it felt to be seen, really seen by someone. "Thanks, I haven't played in a while." "I was nervous." "You didn't look nervous," Aiden said, falling into step beside her. "You looked like, I don't know, like you were exactly where you were supposed to be." Lynn thought about that as they walked together toward the front doors of the school. Maybe he was right. Maybe after all these months of trying to be invisible, of trying to leave her old self behind, she had finally found her way back home. Not to Beijing, but to herself. As they stepped outside into the afternoon sunlight, Lynn felt something she hadn't felt since arriving in America. Hope. Not just that things would get better someday, but that maybe they already had. News spread quickly at Oak Ridge Middle School. By the next morning, it seemed like everyone had heard about Lynn's audition. As she walked through the hallways, she noticed people looking at her differently. Some students she had never spoken to smiled or waved. Others whispered as she passed, but it wasn't the mocking kind of whisper she was used to. Is that her? The piano girl? I heard she played some crazy difficult piece. Mrs. Hudson was crying, that's what I heard. Lynn kept her head down, not sure how to handle this new kind of attention. Part of her wanted to smile back, to embrace this change, but another part remained cautious. She had spent too many months being invisible to suddenly know how to be seen. When Lynn reached her locker, she found Aiden waiting for her, his face bright with excitement. There you are, he said. Have you seen the list? Lynn blinked. What list? The talent show lineup, Aiden explained. Mrs. Hudson posted it this morning. You're the closing act, just like she said. And, he lowered his voice dramatically, they're calling you the special musical guest. No one else got a title like that. Lynn felt her cheeks grow warm. Really? Really. Everyone's talking about it, especially since Zoe's been telling people you're some kind of piano prodigy. That surprised Lynn more than anything else. Zoe said that? Aiden nodded. I know, weird, right? Yesterday she was calling you China Girl, and today she's acting like she discovered you or something. Lynn didn't know what to make of that. She opened her locker, finding comfort in the familiar routine of exchanging books. The photo of her grandmother seemed to smile at her with extra pride today. So, Aiden continued, a bunch of us are having lunch together today. Me, Tyler, Prisha, and a few others. You should join us. The invitation caught Lynn off guard. No one had asked her to sit with them at lunch before. Okay, she said, trying to sound casual. Thanks. As Aiden walked away, Lynn took a deep breath. This was what she had wanted, wasn't it? To make friends, to belong? So why did it make her so nervous? The morning classes passed in a blur. Lynn found it hard to concentrate with so many people looking at her, some even giving her thumbs-up signs when the teacher wasn't looking. By the time lunch arrived, her stomach was in knots. Lynn hesitated outside the cafeteria doors. Maybe she should go to the library instead, where it was quiet and safe. But then she spotted Aiden waving to her from a table in the corner. Surrounded by a group of students Lynn recognized but had never really talked to. Taking a deep breath, Lynn walked toward them. Everyone, this is Lynn, Aiden announced as she approached. The one I was telling you about. A chorus of hellos greeted her. Prisha, a girl from Lynn's English class, scooted over to make room. Sit here, she said, patting the bench beside her. Lynn sat down, placing her lunchbox in front of her. Is it true you're closing the talent show? Asked Tyler, a tall boy with glasses who Lynn knew was on the chess team with Aiden. Lynn nodded. Suddenly shy. That's so cool, said Noor, a quiet girl who Lynn had noticed reading poetry books in the library. What piece are you playing? I'm not sure yet, Lynn admitted. I have a few I'm thinking about. You should play what you did at the audition, Aiden suggested. Mrs. Hudson practically fell off her chair. Everyone laughed and Lynn found herself smiling too. The conversation shifted to other topics. The upcoming science fair, a new movie everyone wanted to see, complaints about Mr. Peterson's impossible history test. To Lynn's surprise, they kept finding ways to include her, asking her opinion or explaining inside jokes so she wouldn't feel left out. It was the best lunch period Lynn had experienced since arriving at Oak Ridge. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Prisha turned to her. We eat together every day, she said. You should join us from now on. The simple invitation nearly brought tears to Lynn's eyes. I'd like that, she said softly. As Lynn gathered her things, she glanced across the cafeteria and accidentally caught Zoe's eye. The popular girl was sitting with her usual group, but instead of the expected sneer, Zoe gave Lynn a small nod before quickly looking away. The rest of the week continued in much the same way. Lynn joined Aiden and his friends for lunch each day, gradually growing more comfortable speaking up and even making them laugh with stories about her first bewildering weeks in America. After school, she spent hours in the music room practicing for the talent show, sometimes with Mrs. Hudson offering guidance, sometimes alone. On Thursday afternoon, as Lynn was finishing up a particularly challenging section of the piece she had chosen for the show. Liszt's La Campanella even more difficult than what she had played at the PAE. Audition, she heard the music room door open. Looking up, she was stunned to see Zoe standing there alone for once without Paige and Amelia flanking her. "Don't stop," Zoe said quickly. "I just wanted to listen for a minute." Lynn hesitated, her fingers still resting on the keys. She wasn't sure she wanted to play with Zoe watching, but something in the other girl's expression, a lack of the usual mockery perhaps, made Lynn decide to continue. She picked up where she had left off, letting the music fill the room. Lynn didn't look at Zoe as she played, focusing instead on the keys, on the complex patterns her fingers needed to create. But she was acutely aware of the other girl's presence, of the strange tension in the air between them. When Lynn finished the section, she finally looked up. Zoe was leaning against the wall, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "That was incredible," Zoe said after a moment. "How long did it take you to learn that?" Lynn was so surprised by the question, by the fact that Zoe was speaking to her normally, that it took her a moment to respond. "About 6 months," she said finally. "My grandmother helped me. She was a piano teacher." Zoe nodded, then seemed to struggle with what to say next. "Look," she began, her voice less confident than Lynn had ever heard it. "About before? The things I said?" Lynn waited, unsure where this was going. "I was a jerk," Zoe said finally, looking at the floor rather than at Lynn. "I'm not good at, I've never been the new kid, or had to learn a new language. It must be really hard." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was more than Lynn had ever expected from Zoe. "It is hard," Lynn agreed quietly. Zoe shifted uncomfortably. "Anyway, you're really good. At piano, Like professional good. Thank you," Lynn said, still wary but touched by the compliment. An awkward silence fell between them. Then Zoe straightened up and moved toward the door. "Well, I should go. Just wanted to, say that." As Zoe reached for the doorknob, Lynn found herself speaking. "I had piano lessons for 8 years, she said, before we moved here. I used to compete." Zoe turned back, looking genuinely interested. "Did you win?" Lynn nodded. "Usually." A small smile crossed Zoe's face, not her usual smirk, but something more genuine. "I'm not surprised," she said. "You're going to kill it at the talent show." With that, she was gone, leaving Lynn staring at the closed door, wondering what had just happened. The day of the talent show arrived with a flurry of activity. School was dismissed early so the auditorium could be prepared, and students in the show were excused from their last 2 classes to rehearse. Lynn's parents had promised to be there, her father even getting permission to leave work early for the first time since they had moved. As Lynn walked to the music room for one final practice session, she thought about how much had changed in just 10 days. She had gone from being invisible to having friends who saved her a seat at lunch, from being mocked for even touching the piano to being featured as the show's closing act. Even Zoe had stopped calling her China Girl, using her real name instead when they passed in the hallway. It was as if playing the piano had somehow made her real to them. Or perhaps it had made her real to herself again. Lynn settled at the piano for her final practice, running through the most challenging parts of her piece. She had chosen La Campanella for its technical difficulty, yes, but also for its joyful, almost playful quality. It was a piece that showcased not just skill, but spirit. The perfect way to introduce herself. The real Lynn Chen to her new school. As the final notes echoed in the empty room, Lynn heard soft clapping from the doorway. She turned to find Mrs. Hudson watching her with a proud smile. "You're more than ready," the teacher said. "Are you nervous?" Lynn considered the question. "A little," she admitted. "But a good kind of nervous. Like before a competition?" Mrs. Hudson nodded approvingly. "That's the right attitude. Channel that energy into your performance." She paused, then added, "In all my years of teaching, I've never had a student with your level of talent. I've called some friends at the State Conservatory. They're coming tonight to hear you play. If you're interested, they offer scholarships for their weekend program." Lynn's eyes widened. "Really?" "Really," Mrs. Hudson confirmed. "This could be just the beginning for you, Lynn, if that's what you want." Lynn thought about her grandmother, about the dreams they had shared back in Beijing. Dreams that had seemed impossible after they sold the piano, after they left everything behind. "It's what I want," she said softly. Mrs. Hudson squeezed her shoulder gently. Then let's get ready to show them what you can do. As Lynn followed her teacher out of the music room, she felt a strange sense of coming full circle. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been the girl who was teased for even touching the piano. Tonight, she would be the girl who left them speechless. And for the first time since moving to America, Lynn felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families and students filed in, filling the rows of seats facing the stage. Backstage, performers rushed about in a nervous frenzy, checking costumes, practicing lines, stretching and pacing. The organized chaos of a school talent show was in full swing. Lynn stood in a quiet corner away from the commotion. She wore a simple blue dress her mother had insisted on buying for the occasion, their first non-essential purchase since moving to America. For your special night, her mother had said, eyes shining with pride as Lynn tried it on. Now, as Lynn smoothed the fabric with slightly trembling hands, she could hear the audience growing larger beyond the curtain. She peeked out from behind the stage wing and scanned the crowd. Her parents were already seated in the third row, her father looking uncomfortable in his good shirt, her mother clutching a small bouquet of flowers they couldn't really afford. There you are. Aiden appeared beside her in a black suit that was slightly too big for him. Everyone's looking for you. Mrs. Hudson wants all performers. In the green room for final instructions, Lynn nodded and followed him down the narrow hallway to the classroom that had been converted into a makeshift green room. Inside, the other acts were gathered around Mrs. Hudson, who was reviewing the performance order one last time. And finally, our special musical guest, Lin Chen, will close the show with a piano performance, Mrs. Hudson concluded, giving Lynn an encouraging smile. Remember, everyone, this is your night to shine. Have fun and do your best. As the group dispersed, Lynn felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Prisha, who would be performing a traditional Indian dance halfway through the show. Are you nervous? Prisha asked, her bangles jingling as she adjusted her colorful costume. A little, Lynn admitted. But I've performed before. Just not here. Not in English, Prisha laughed. You don't have to speak for your act, silly. Lynn smiled. I know, but I have to introduce myself. Say the name of my piece. You'll be great, Prisha assured her. We're all rooting for you. The stage manager, a high school student with a headset and clipboard, stuck his head into the room. 5 minutes to curtain. First 3 acts, please get in position. The room erupted into a flurry of last-minute preparations. Lynn retreated to her quiet corner, closing her eyes and mentally running through her piece one last time. She could play La Campanella in her sleep by now, but still, the pressure of performing it perfectly tonight weighed on her. Lynn? A voice broke her concentration. She opened her eyes to find Zoe standing before her, already dressed in the sparkly outfit for her dance routine. For once, Zoe looked almost as nervous as Lynn felt. I just wanted to say good luck, Zoe said awkwardly. Not that you need it. You're going to be amazing. Before Lynn could respond, Zoe hurried away to join Paige and Amelia. Lynn stared after her, still not entirely used to this new version of Zoe who said nice things and used her actual name. The talent show began with the principal's welcome address, followed by a 6th-grade boy who performed an enthusiastic, if slightly off-key rendition of a popular song. The audience clapped encouragingly, setting a supportive tone for the evening. Lynn watched from backstage as act after act took their turn. Jugglers, singers, a comedy duo, a surprisingly good rock band formed by 8th-grade boys, Prisha's beautiful dance, and Aiden's magic act, which went much better than his audition. When Zoe's group performed their dance routine, even Lynn had to admit they were talented, their movements perfectly synchronized. As the evening progressed, Lynn felt her nerves slowly transforming into excitement. This was what she had missed during her months of trying to be invisible. The energy of performing, of sharing something she loved with others. Finally, after the second-to-last act had taken their bow, Mrs. Hudson stepped onto the stage, and now, she announced, her voice filled with unmistakable pride, for our final performance of the evening, please welcome our special musical guest, Lin Chen, who will be playing Franz Liszt's La Campanella on piano. The audience applauded as Lynn walked onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. She made her way to the grand piano that had been moved from the music room to the center of the stage, its polished surface gleaming under the spotlights. Lynn took a moment to adjust the bench, then looked out at the audience. In the sea of faces, she found her parents, her mother already dabbing at her eyes, her father sitting straight and tall, a rare smile on his usually serious face. In the wings, she could see Mrs. Hudson giving her an encouraging nod, and in the front rows, Aiden, Prisha, and her new friends watched expectantly. Lynn took a deep breath and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she thought of her grandmother, thousands of miles away in Beijing. "This is for you, Nai," she whispered to herself, and then she began to play. From the very first notes, quick, light, and incredibly difficult, the audience fell completely silent. Lynn's fingers danced across the keys with precision and speed that belied her age. La campanella, which means little bell in Italian, required not just technical skill but an almost supernatural dexterity, with rapid jumps across the keyboard that few adult pianists could master. As the piece progressed, building in intensity and complexity, Lynn felt that familiar sense of disappearing into the music, of becoming simply a vessel for something larger than herself. Her hands moved almost independently, finding each note with perfect accuracy while her mind floated somewhere above, guiding the emotional arc of the piece. She was dimly aware of the audience's stillness, of the complete attention focused on her performance. But mostly she was aware of the music itself, the way it filled the auditorium, the way it expressed things she had never been able to put into words. Her loneliness during those first months in America, her homesickness, but also her hope, her determination, her joy in finding herself again. As Lynn approached the final, most difficult section of the piece, a flurry of notes that required her hands to cross and leap at dizzying speeds, she felt a surge of confidence. This was who she was, not the quiet girl who hid in the library during lunch, not the easy target for bullies. She was Lynn Chen, pianist, and this was her moment to show them all. The final notes rang out, clear and triumphant, and Lynn lifted her hands from the keys. For a split second, there was complete silence. Then the auditorium erupted. The applause was deafening, immediately accompanied by people rising to their feet. Lynn blinked in surprise at the standing ovation, at the whistles and cheers that filled the room. Her parents were standing, her mother openly crying now, her father clapping with uncharacteristic abandon. Lynn stood and took a small bow, the way her grandmother had taught her. As she straightened, she caught sight of Mrs. Hudson in the wings, wiping tears from her eyes while trying to maintain her composure. Next to her stood two elegant-looking adults Lynn didn't recognize, the people from the conservatory, she realized with a jolt. Looking back at the audience, Lynn saw Aiden and her other new friends on their feet, cheering wildly. Even Zoe and her friends were standing and applauding, genuine amazement on their faces. As Lynn took a second bow, flowers suddenly appeared on the stage, tossed by audience members, including the small bouquet her mother had brought. The principal hurried onto the stage, shaking Lynn's hand with enthusiasm before turning to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice barely audible over the continued applause, "I think we've just witnessed something extraordinary." "Lynn Chen, everyone!" More applause, more cheers. Lynn felt overwhelmed, her cheeks hot with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure. This wasn't Beijing, where she had been one of many talented young pianists. Here, her playing stood out in a way it never had before. As she left the stage, Lynn was immediately surrounded by her fellow performers, all talking at once. "That was incredible. How did you make your fingers move so fast? Are you famous in China or something?" Before Lynn could answer any of their questions, her parents pushed through the crowd, her mother enveloping her in a tight hug. "My Xiaolin," her mother whispered in Mandarin, "I am so proud of you." Her father, more reserved but no less moved, simply placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. In his eyes, Lynn saw everything he couldn't say, his pride, his love, his recognition of the daughter he had always known she was. Mrs. Hudson approached next, the two adults from the conservatory following behind her. "Lynn, I'd like you to meet Professor Davis and Professor Kim from the State Conservatory," she said. "They were very impressed by your performance and would like to speak with you about their weekend program for gifted students." What followed was a blur of congratulations, introductions, and excitement. The conservatory professors spoke of scholarships and opportunities. Her parents listened with growing wonder, and Lynn tried to take it all in. still riding the high of her performance. As the crowd began to disperse, Lynn found herself face to face with Zoe once more. This time Zoe wasn't alone. Paige and Amelia stood beside her, but their usual smirks were replaced with expressions of genuine respect. "That was amazing, Lynn," Zoe said simply. "I've never heard anyone play like that." "Thank you," Lynn replied, finding that the anger and hurt she had carried for months had somehow dissolved in the triumph of the evening. "We're having a party at my house next weekend," Zoe continued, a bit hesitantly, "to celebrate the show. You should come, if you want." It wasn't quite an apology for all the months of teasing, but Lynn understood it was the closest thing to one she was likely to get, and somehow it was enough. "Maybe I will," Lynn said with a small smile. "Thanks for inviting me." As Zoe and her friends walked away, Aiden appeared at Lynn's side, grinning from ear to ear. "So," he said, "still think you don't have any talents?" Lynn laughed, a free, open laugh that felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I guess I have one or two," she admitted, looking around at her beaming parents, her encouraging teacher, her new friends, and the opportunities suddenly opening before her. Lynn felt something settle inside her, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with where she was from or what language she spoke. She belonged to the music, and through it she had found her place in this new world. The girl who had once been teased for touching the piano had become the girl who left them speechless. And that, Lynn realized, was only the beginning.